I invite you to be opening your Bibles this morning to the Old Testament book of Numbers. The Old Testament book of Numbers. As we continue our studies of Jesus in the Old Testament. Jesus all through the Bible. He's the reason that we're here today. He's our hope of everlasting life. Jesus in the Old Testament. And this morning, Jesus and the wilderness. The children of Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. In fact, we know the book as Numbers. And the reason we know it as Numbers is because whenever they were translating the Bible from Hebrew, the Old Testament language, into Greek, one that the people of the day could read in the time of Alexander the Great, they looked at the first part of each one of the books to give it a name that would be significant and give people an idea of what the book included. And in the very first part of the book of Numbers, there's a census. And there is a counting of all of those who were over 20 of the men. They didn't count the women. And they didn't count the children who were 20 or younger. They only counted the men who were over 20. And because of that numbering, the book has been known to us as the book of Numbers. To the Jewish people, to the Hebrew people, it was known as In the Wilderness. It was the wilderness book. But to us, it's a book of Numbers. And in case in some of your studies you come across reference to the wilderness book, you don't have to search for another book that should be in the Bible and is not. But you can see that we're talking about the very same book. This numbering. In fact, God tells us exactly how many men there were of fighting age that came out of the land of Egypt under the direction of Moses. And there were 603,000 men. 603,000 men. And that's really how we come up with the idea that there were probably well over 2 million people in all, because you take these men who are old enough to go into battle or fight, and 21 or over, and most of them being married, and assuming that they have children, maybe even multiple children, and you add those numbers all together, and you come up with over 2 million. And so that's how we come up with the estimate of 2 million people coming out of the land of Egypt. And that's significant. We might ask, why was there this numbering? And why did God tell us this? And one reason, very obviously to us by the time we come to the end of the book of Numbers, is that every one of these men that God numbers here in the first part of the book of Numbers dies in the wilderness. Every single one of them. And they died in the wilderness except for Joshua and Caleb, even Moses, even Aaron. But all of these men except 2 die in the wilderness because of their rebellion against God whenever they came to the land of promise. And this is all recorded for us here in this book. They come to the land of promise after they have left Mount Sinai, where they received the law with regard to their instructions from God through Moses to the people, the law that contained the 10 commandments that we're more familiar with. It tells about the building of the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and we talked about that just a few Sundays ago. And last week we talked about the priest that God describes for those people living under the Old Testament law, the priest of the tribe of Levi. We spent time looking at that last week. But as God brings these people from Mount Sinai to the southern part of the land of promise, to the region of Kadesh Barnea, He tells them to send spies into the land, not to spy out the land for a possible invasion, but actually to see what was there, to see that God had in fact been faithful in describing this land that flowed with milk and honey. The cities were enormous. The cities were greater than anything they had ever seen. The harvest was plentiful. In fact, they bring back a cluster of grapes that took 2 men to carry it. I mean, there's physical evidence for all the people to see of the bounty of this land. There are storerooms full of food already. Their granaries are full of grain. Everything's in place for those people to move out and the children of Israel to move in. And God's wanting them to see that this is a land that truly flowed with milk and honey. He's not wanting them to investigate to see whether they're able to invade or not. God will take care of that. He's wanting them to see what they're about to inherit. But yet, as they're looking, they're distracted, and they see the enormity of the cities, the defense of the cities, the giants that were in part of that land, and they come back with 10 of them very depressed, saying, "We cannot do this. We're just grasshoppers." And 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, saying, "Yes, we can." But because of the heart of the people, not just of those 10 spies, the people, had they been willing to follow the will of God, they would have gone on in. But the people sided with the 10 spies, and they said, we cannot take this land. And God said, okay. I told you to go, and you said no, and now, regardless of what you may think, regardless of how you may feel after I deliver my judgment against you, you will not inherit this land. The land that I promised you is going to go to your children. And all of those who are 20 and below will live, and all of those who are above 20 are going to die. Their children will inherit the land. They will not. Now they make an attempt. They decide, okay, we made a mistake. We're going to go ahead and go in, and God tells Moses, tell them not to do that. Tell them not to do that. God said go, they said no. Now they're saying go, and God says no, and they tried anyway, and they were defeated. And so God sends them into the wilderness to die. To die. For the next 40 years, the carcasses of those unfaithful people will litter the wilderness until they're all gone. And that's where we're going to find ourselves this morning in our looking at Jesus and the wilderness. There are so many examples. There are so many times. And in fact, on one occasion when God gives them water from the rock, He's going to talk to us about that in passing this morning. But when God gives them water from the rock, He tells Moses, strike the rock and water will come out. And Moses did. He struck the rock and water came out. God tells us later in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that rock was Christ. I mean, that's God's own commentary. That's not me reading something into the Scripture. God says that rock that provided the water was Christ. Jesus was there. And we're going to see Him even more so this morning. But this morning we're not talking about that unfaithful generation, because they have all died in the wilderness, and now after the last one has died, they again come to the southern part of the land of promise, and they're about to go in, and we're going to see some things happening as they make their way those last few miles. Their children are there. All of the adults have died. Their children are there to inherit the land. And a question I want us to think about all through our studies this morning is, what have our children learned from us? And if your children are young, ask yourself the question, what am I teaching my children? Because these children, when they first came to Kadesh Barnea, to the southern part of the land of promise, they were children, but now they're grown-up adults. Now they're grown-up adults. And how are they going to act? What are we teaching our children? What did those children learn from their parents? So I want you to begin with me in Numbers chapter 21. We're going to go all the way toward the end of the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 21, but beginning in verse 1, and most of our lesson is going to be right here this morning. We're going to read the first 3 verses. I want you to listen to what God is saying here. When the Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming by the way of Atharim, then he fought against Israel and took some of them captive. So Israel made a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities." And the Lord heard the voices of Israel and delivered up the Canaanites. Then they utterly destroyed them and their cities. Thus the name of the place was called Hormah. Or the name of the place was called Utter Destruction. So what are these children doing? The children who have now become adults, what are they doing? They come up against an enemy. And this is the first time they've come up against an enemy on their own, without any of their parents there. Now, their parents would have been at least 60, 61. If they had been living, they would have been at least that old, because it's been 40 years, and they had to be at least 21 to have been cursed. The curse of death was upon them, that it may take 40 years. I don't know what the last few of them were thinking. I don't know what any of them were thinking, because, until they actually see that yes, we're dying off. There's not as many of us as there was yesterday, or there's not as many of us as there was last year. I find it, on one hand, when we talk about things like Memorial Day or Veterans Day, I find it very uplifting that men and women and even a nation of people are willing to give themselves so completely, for our defense, for my freedom, for my future. I find it a little disturbing in my heart. It hurts in my heart whenever I read, and I know it's going to happen because we all get older, that there's fewer of that great generation left living today. And I'm going, my grandchildren are going to grow up not even knowing or not even seeing any of those men and women who gave so much, and then those that you or I will never know who gave the ultimate sacrifice. I don't know if the children of Israel were talking about things like this whenever they're walking through the wilderness, or if some of the old-timers are saying, there's not as many of us left. Not many of us left. We're dying off. That's a generation that's going to all be gone before they get to enter in. I don't know if the last few of them were thinking, maybe I'll slip in. Maybe I'll beat the odds. Maybe God's seen enough death, and so He's going to let me go in, but not so. They all die. Now their first test, they come up against a king who is the king of, really the meaning there is of the southern portion. And so he's the king of the south, and they come up against him, and in that first engagement, some of the children of Israel were captured. And then they do what? They've learned from their parents. It's a good thing. They call on the name of the Lord. And they make a vow to the Lord. If you will deliver us from these people, if you will deliver these people into our hands, then we will destroy everything that they stand for. And God heard their prayer. And He gave them what they asked for. So the very first engagement of this new generation is to call upon the name of the Lord, and God bless them. They took this very seriously. This was not something done in passing, because they make an oath to God. They make a commitment to God. And God responded in kind to them, gave them exactly what they were asking for. And He gives them a victory. He gives them a resounding victory. But then read on with me, if you will. In verse 4 of chapter 21 of the book of Numbers. Then they set out from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient because of the journey. Let's stop right there. Road trip. Does that bring back any memories? Talk about families, about parents and children. Road trip. Does that bring back any memories? I mean, a lot of them hopefully are good memories. I remember one road trip we went on as a family. We had a big old van, and we're going to go on vacation, and we were living in North Arkansas, and we're going to go down to San Antonio. I know that may not have been a good choice, but that's what we were doing. And so we decided that on our limited funds that Judy is doing so well in helping us in managing things. We had a good friend in Kentucky who raised turkeys. And I could have all the turkey meat I wanted just by saying, Lawrence, I need to come out. And he would let me go out and call his turkeys. And so we always had turkey. And so Judy cooks up a bunch of turkey, and we're going to put it in an ice chest, and she makes turkey salad and sliced turkey and in every way that you could eat turkey on a piece of bread while you're still moving in the van. And it was a great plan. And Judy and I ourselves, we loved, turkey salad. About the fourth day of turkey salad, I knew every time the kids opened one of the back windows, they didn't open all the way, they didn't roll down, they kind of pop out a little bit to let air in back there. I knew, just from the sound, poof, and air's coming. I know what's happening. Turkey's feeding the animals that come up and down the road. And they're going, is there any other choice? Now listen to what's happening here. This is a road trip. This is not a trip from Mountain Home, Arkansas to San Antonio. This is a trip that had lasted 40 years. This is a long road trip. And they set out from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the people became impatient because of the journey. Now, there's reasons they're going around Edom. Those are their cousins. And there's been problems before, and they're trying to avoid this problem, but as they're trying to avoid that problem, another one comes up. And the people spoke against God and Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this miserable food. You see, along with the good that they've learned from their parents, to call on the name of the Lord when you're in distress. 3 of the Psalms talk about it. Psalm 120, Psalm 121, and Psalm 122. If you just take the first verse of each of those Psalms. Now they learned that part because the first verse of Psalm 120 is in my distress I called unto the Lord and He heard me. Oh, that's powerful. And the second one, I will look unto the hills from whence comes my help. Oh, that's powerful. And the third one said, I will be glad when they say unto me, let us go to the house of the Lord. They know where their help's coming from. So they've learned that. We've already seen that. But now here is something else they've learned from their parents. They're whining. They're complaining. This trip is too long. You brought us out of the land of Egypt to die in the wilderness. How many times had their parents said that? How many times had they watched their parents suffer, and because of the suffering of their parents, they themselves as children have suffered? Because their parents said, you brought us out of the land of Egypt to die out here, and there's no food, and there's no water. Oh, they learned that. They learned that, and they learned that well. They also learned God's response to that, but that didn't sink in. They learned from their parents to complain. And this is not just a complaint. It's not just a complaint. This is a direct assault on God and Moses. Listen to what God says. They spoke against God and Moses, but they spoke against God. And what have they said to God? You brought us out here to die. And number 2, there is no food and no water. And number 3, this food that we've been eating is detestable. Let me put that in our language today. Manna. Manna. Now that's really not our language, is it? That's Hebrew. You know what it means in English? It means, what is it? Because the first time they saw it, they didn't know what it was. And so all these Hebrew people go out and they see the ground outside of their camp surrounding these 2 million people out as far as they can see. It looks like snow, but it's in the warmer months and it's in the desert. And they're looking out there, and it's all around the camp of 2 million people, just as far out as they can see. And God says, it's your food. And I know that they were a little apprehensive. You would have been too. God says, go out and gather it up, and you could eat it right off the ground. I mean, you could just pick it up, and it was small, even like cornmeal. And you could just scoop it up and eat it. God said that it tasted like honey. I don't know that we've ever experienced anything like that. Or you can take it and you can grind it a little finer and you can make flour out of it, or you can cook it just like it is, make little cakes out of it. And it's even been referred to as the food of angels. And there it is. And they're saying, what is it? And what is it in Hebrew is manna. And so they're saying, look at all this manna. And this is what they're unhappy with. One of the things they're unhappy with, as they speak against God, you brought us out here in the wilderness to die. There is no food and there is no water. And this detestable food, we can't stand it anymore. Let me read exactly what it says. Now, this is certainly an emotional response, a deep emotional response. From 40 years, this is a response. Disgust, abhor, weary. Those are 3 of the words that apply right here. This miserable, 3 of the words from Hebrews that apply right here. But the strongest one is vomit. It said, if we eat another bite of this food, I think I'm going to vomit. That's what they're saying to God. It wasn't just what our kids were saying to us about turkey salad. This is what they're saying to God, who has fed them for 40 years, who's clothed them, who's gone before them, who's fighting for them, and who just gave them a major victory. They're saying, God, your food makes us sick. Makes us sick. What are we teaching our children? Now listen to verse 6. So the Lord's response to this, the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. So the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned because we have spoken against the Lord, and you intercede with the Lord that he may remove the serpents from us. And Moses interceded for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a standard, and it shall come about that anyone who is bitten, when he looks upon it, he will live. Make a serpent out of brass. Make an image of this serpent and put it up on a pole so that everybody that wants to can see it. And so Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a standard, and it came about that if a serpent bit any man, when he looked to the bronze serpent, he lived. Fiery serpents. The people are asking, remove the serpents. I mean, isn't that what Egypt had done? Isn't that what Pharaoh had done? Every one of the plagues that came along? Whether it was frogs, and there's frogs everywhere, all through the land of Egypt, even in Pharaoh's house, even in his bedroom, everywhere there's frogs, and they say, make them go away. Or whenever there were flies were everywhere, and what do they say? Make them go away. It seems to be the general response whenever something unpleasant is happening to us. We want it to go away. But I want us to notice what God did. He didn't make the snakes go away. He could have. That's what the people want. Make the serpents go away. But what did God do instead? He provided a way that you could live through it. He provided a way that you could, we'll see some of God's own language later in His commentary on this, how you can endure it. See, we want God to make everything like we want it to be, even though we're in rebellion against Him. God doesn't always take the trouble away. The brass serpent, make it out of brass. Put it up on a pole so everyone can see it. Jesus. Jesus. In fact, Jesus is going to use this very incident so that you understand, and I want you to understand, and I know that you do, that I'm not making this stuff up. Here it is, and Jesus is going to tell us that, yes, that was real, and it did happen, and those serpents were deadly, and there were over 23,000 people died. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. But God wasn't talking just about them. He was pointing to Jesus. He wasn't just talking about people that were bit by serpents. He was talking about us and all of mankind that we've been bitten by sin. And listen to what Jesus says in John chapter 3. Go to John chapter 3, the New Testament. And I want you to hear the context. We talk about the context. Now, we all know what John 3:16 says. I think that most of the whole world may know what John 3:16 said. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. And we go, isn't that a wonderful verse? But what does it say right before that? No, you're already looking, so you can't answer that question. What does it say right after that? Well, let's listen. In verse 14, John chapter 3, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whoever believes in Him will have eternal life. Right there in the context of one of the most significant verses for mankind ever. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Right in the middle of what God is saying, He talks about that. And He's coming all the way back over here to the time of Moses. It just says, Moses lifted up that serpent on a pole, on a standard, so that everyone could see it. God is going to have His own Son lifted up for the very same reason. For the very same reason. For the salvation, not of people's lives, but of their souls. In verse 17 of John chapter 3, for God did not send His Son into the world to judge the world, even though the world will be judged by Jesus. But God did not send His Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through Him. I wonder what the people thought in the time of Moses. God says, put this serpent on a pole. And you tell the people, if anyone is bitten, let them look upon that serpent and they'll live. God didn't take the serpents away. He didn't take the fiery bite away. He didn't take the poison away. He provides a way of salvation. Now, if I listen to people today, maybe some of you have thought this. If I listen to people today, that pretty much explains to me what people back then were thinking. What do you mean? Whose idea was this to put a serpent on a pole? We've never had a serpent on a pole. Never. We've seen God do amazing things, but a serpent on a pole? And you expect me to look at that serpent? My mom never looked at a serpent on a pole. My family's never looked at serpents on poles. I mean, what are you talking about? I want to be saved the same way my dad was saved. Seriously, stay with me. What happened to your dad? Remember, we're back over here with Moses. I want to be saved the same way my mom was saved. I want to be saved the same way my grandmother was saved. Come back over here with me for a minute. What happened to your mother? She died in the wilderness. Why? Because she rebelled against God. What happened to your dad? Go ahead, tell me, what happened to your dad? He died in the wilderness. Why? Because he rebelled against God. So you're standing here, and here's this brass serpent on a pole, and you're telling me you want to be saved the same way your mom and dad were lost? Honesty, stay with me. Stay with me. Now, we don't say it that way to people, though, do we? Be careful with that. Well, we've never had a serpent in... Whose idea was this? Moses, are you sure you got that right? If God can save me by that serpent on the pole, with me looking at it, if He can save me laying here in the floor of my tent, just writhing in pain, about to die. You know, because it's the power of God. Are you telling me that's... No, I'm not telling you anything. My brother likes to point this out. He said, you can always tell a Texan, but you just can't tell him much. No, I'm not telling you that if you don't look at that serpent, you'll die if you're bitten. God is telling you. And then Jesus makes it clear by bringing the commentary, God's commentary, back upon that whenever He says, that's exactly what God did through Jesus. He is the only way to be saved. That's not man's idea. That's God's idea. And if you don't have faith enough to look to Jesus, then you'll die in your agony. You'll die in your sin. I don't know how it could be any clearer. Manna and serpents are today and sin. I don't know how it could be any clearer. God's not talking about manna and serpents, really. He's talking about us today and Jesus. If we'll listen to Him. Jesus said, John chapter 6 and verse 35, and we've seen this several weeks. Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. I'm the bread of life. If anyone believes in me, He said, if anyone eats of this bread, he'll never die. And the people are wanting to live forever, and so they're saying, give us some of this bread then. And Jesus wasn't talking about physical bread. What have we learned? What are we teaching our children? Now go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and the lesson is yours. Listen to what God says here. Beginning in verse 1, He says, For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them. The rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. That's God's judgment on them, not mine. Now, those things happened as examples for us. Should get our attention. It didn't just happen to them. God says it happened, and they are examples for us. Why did God allow those things to happen? Hopefully so that you and I would learn, so that we would not crave evil things as they also crave. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyers. Now all these things happened to them as an example, they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. He said all of that happened for a reason. And the reason all of that happened is so that we would learn from that, from our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. So then the next verse of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Now for the person, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. Be careful if you're trusting in yourself, because you can fall very easily and very quickly. Now, God's explanation of sin and temptation: no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but will, with the temptation, will provide the way of escape also, so that you may be able to endure it. To them, it was the pole with a bronze snake on it. And still many of them died. To us, it's our Lord Jesus Christ. That's always been God's plan. And yet still, many die. God doesn't take away the temptation. God doesn't take away the sting of sin while we're in this life. But He will take away the guilt. And He will provide a way so that we can endure it. So will you? Will you turn and look to that bronze serpent? Will you make out of it more than what God wanted or intended? We'll talk more about this later when we get there, the Lord allowing time to continue. But you know what they do with that bronze serpent? They make an idol out of it. They decide to worship it instead of God. And Hezekiah later is going to destroy it for that very reason. Be careful. As Moses lifted up the serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that all who believe in Him can find salvation. If you're looking for it, it's here. Come right now while we stand and sing.